Gospel lesson this morning comes from John's Gospel, the second chapter, verses 1 through 11. It's a familiar story, and you know the danger of familiar stories is you think you know what it says. So listen more carefully because it's a familiar story. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you or to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. Jesus said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. May God add a blessing to this reading of the word. Just remember that if I say anything that contradicts Dr. Niedner at 10:30, I'm right, and he's wrong. It's simple. Probably not. Sometimes when I go to the grocery store and I see a young child asking for something that they've seen on the shelf that they want so badly, there's a little bit of a tear in my heart. Part of me, who was a parent once, wants to tell the little kid, "Oh, stop it." The part of me that was a little kid once wants to say, "You go, boy. You go, girl. Ask for what you want. Ask for what you want. Ask for the bounty that you desire." Because when I was a little kid, my brother and my sister were both teenagers when I was born. So as I was growing up, I wanted more than anything to be a grown-up. And so I didn't do anything that I thought would mark me as being a little kid. And among the things that I did not do was ask for what I wanted, because I didn't see the grown-ups around me. I didn't see my older brother and sister or my parents begging each other for things. So as I went through the 5 and dime store and saw those cheap little toys there, and my heart said, "Oh gosh, I want one of those," I bit my tongue. And somehow it seems to me that a part of being a human being, to being a full human being, is at least knowing what it is that your heart desires and to ask for it, to reach out for abundance. Maybe that's why I like this story, this very strange story out of the Gospel of John. I warned you to listen carefully to the story because, as always, whenever there's a miraculous work involved, we tend to get distracted by it. And we tend to assume that it is the miraculous act which is the important thing in the story. And I want to suggest to you that it is not the important thing in the story. There are details in this narrative that we get from John about Jesus' first miraculous act that are not focused
on the miraculous thing that Jesus does. And in fact, when John tells the story, I don't know whether you noticed this, when John tells you the story, he does not recount or relate the actual moment at which the wine changes. Everything that happens in the story is in anticipation of the act and in appreciation of the act looking backwards, but the actual changing of the wine isn't recounted at all. Jesus says, pour water into the jars, and he says, now draw some off and take it to the steward. And the steward tastes the water, and John says, which has now become wine. So the actual moment at which this miraculous thing takes place isn't even in the story. Which suggests to me, at least, that that's because it's not the most important thing that happens. What happens before it and what happens after it is really more critical and more worthy of our attention. John starts out this account by telling us that there was a wedding in Cana. And who was invited to this wedding? Who was there? Who's the first person? Jesus' mother was at the wedding. And oh, by the way, Jesus and his disciples were invited too. The important person that we need to know who was invited to this wedding is Mary, the mother of Jesus. So we can assume this is in Cana, which is just about 8 to 10 miles away from Nazareth. This is a family wedding. And the father of the bride, or the father of the groom, or the groom himself, or the bride herself, is probably either a very close family friend or a relative of Mary's. Perhaps the father of the bride or the father of the groom is a brother of Mary's. We don't know. We're not told. But it's Mary is the connection. Mary is the reason we're all at the wedding. And when Mary discovers that they don't have enough wine, Mary is, for some reason, personally involved with this crisis. How many of you have planned a wedding and carried a wedding out for a daughter or a granddaughter? Raise your hands. Yeah. How many months do you plan in advance for these things? You know, getting the hall ready, deciding what the colors are and about the flowers and the dress and, you know, where you're going to get the food and all of this stuff. And you're inviting people who are coming from Texas and Canada and Italy and Florida and, you know, you get them all there. Well, things are not different 2,000 years ago in Cana of Galilee. A wedding is an important event. In fact, maybe more important than they are now because they went on 4 days. And this is a culture wherein hospitality is a critical value, much more than it is for us. So this family has invited people from all over. You know, 8 to 10 miles might not seem a lot to you when you can jump in your Ford Focus and drive on over there. But Mary and Jesus and the disciples and everybody else walked those 8 to 10 miles to get to that wedding. People came from all over, and they stayed for days, and they were expecting to be fed. They were expecting music and dancing and celebration and laughter. And, you know, whether you like it or not, wine is an aspect of laughter, and it sort of, it lubricates the relationships. And it's important. It's an important aspect. So when Mary discovers that whoever this person is, her relative, her sibling, whatever, this important event, if something goes wrong with this, something seriously wrong, like there's not enough wine, the people involved are never going to hear the end of it. I mean, seriously, this is not going to be something we all laugh about years from now. This is going to be a major faux pas. This guy is going to be the guy who ran out of wine before the wedding was over, forever. So it seems maybe not like such an important thing, but it is really a crisis, and Mary is somehow intimately involved with this crisis. It matters to her. And she turns to Jesus and says, "They're out of wine." Like it was her wedding. And Jesus says, "Well, what's that got to do with us?" Clearly, Jesus does not come to this wedding anticipating doing a miracle. That was not part of his plan. And even when the crisis is in front of him and he understands the gravity of it as much as anyone, he does not necessarily see it as an opportunity for anything for him. Mary somehow knows that Jesus is capable of fixing this thing. I don't know whether she's been kind of trying to contain and corral his little miraculous works all his life, or whether she just knows him well enough to know that he has resources that he can tap that no one else can. But it's clear that she knows that he can fix this, and she anticipates that he will share her angst about the problem and that he will then do something about it. But even when it's pointed out to him, he clearly does not see why this has anything to do with him. And then what happens next? Somebody over here laughed when I read it. Who was that, by the way, just out of curiosity? Well, you were right to laugh. I mean, there are places in the Bible where you are supposed to laugh. And I think that's one of them. Because the thing that happens between Mary and Jesus is as normal as every relationship between a mother and a son. My dad used to have this saying when my mother would exasperate him. He would, lay out a logical argument, rational, down the line, A, B, C, D, about why he was right about the way a certain thing should go. And then she would just look at him blankly, and she said, "Yes, but when you do it my way, do this." And then my dad used to say, "A woman convinced against her will is of the same opinion still." And I'm sorry, ladies, but every man in history knows what my dad was talking about. And every man in history reading this passage and thinking about either A, their mother, or B, their wife, for generations before Jesus and for generations after, we have all experienced this. What does this got to do with me? Yes, I know, but when you go ahead and do this thing that I told you to do, it's like, we all know this. That's why and it was a guy over here who laughed because she heard him, but she didn't hear him. And he knew that she never would hear him and that he was going to fix this. Whether he rolled his eyes or not, we don't know. That's not in the text. So this is a story that rings true with us. We know what's going on here. Jesus comes into this setting without the intention of creating a miracle. But a miracle is necessary for just this very human, everyday need for abundance, which is wine at the wedding that won't run out. Jesus doesn't think that this is his time to interfere in the natural order of things. His mother disagrees. This is so ordinary. But she knows what she wants, and she asks for it. Fix this, Jesus, is the subtext. She asks for the abundance that she desires, that she wants. This wedding is important, and it needs to go right, and you can fix it. So she says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. There's no more arguments. Jesus just looks at the servants and says, "Okay, you see these ritual jars, these giant jars, these big jars, and we're talking 130 gallons." He says, "Fill them with water." And so the servants fill it with water. And he says, "Now draw some of that out and take it to the steward." And they do that. And the steward, not knowing where it came from, but the servants knew, and the disciples knew, because they had seen it. And the steward takes this wine to the bridegroom and says, "You're amazing. Normal people serve the good wine first, and then when everybody is too drunk to tell the difference, they serve the swill. But not you. You serve really good wine first and then really better wine second. You're an excellent host. People are now going to remember this wedding for years, not because the wine ran out, but because the bridegroom and his parents were the models of good hospitality and good hosts and hostesses. They went beyond what was expected. They're going to be remembered in the neighborhood for years. You remember that when Sally and George got married? That was like the best wedding ever. Remember that wine? It was fantastic. So Mary gets the thing, that ordinary abundance, that ordinary blessing that she wants. But then you have to understand that something else much more significant, even than that very ordinarily significant thing, happens. And that is that the servants know what happened. And the disciples see it, and they know what happened, and they believe in Jesus. Jesus has been revealed to them, and not by the fact that he does a super cool magic act. That's what I mean when I say that don't get distracted by the miracle of changing water into wine, because there is a symbolic layer to the meaning of that action, which is far more significant. These jars that were sitting there were jars that were used for ritual cleansing in the old religion, in the religion of Judaism that Jesus and his disciples and all the wedding guests grew up in. These were ordinary aspects of religious life. They would be filled, they would be used for kind of a ritual cleansing, and it was all part of the religious life, a religious life that was becoming drained of its vigor and its power. And Jesus takes that ordinary and not very powerful ritual water and turns it into the best wine that you can possibly imagine. Wine that was delicious to taste. Wine that would probably just lubricate social interactions but never get anybody fully drunk. Wine that would never, no matter how much you drank, would never give you a hangover. This is wine that it's like perfect wine that does all the good things and none of the bad things. And it's a symbol for the new life which is coming into the world through Jesus Christ. It's a symbol for the new religion that's replacing the old religion. It's a symbol for the new life that's replacing the old life. And Jesus didn't know that he was going to do this thing, and yet John tells us that this is the first of the signs that Jesus did. And if you count them in John, there are 7 of them. And each and every one of the signs in John's gospel, the point and purpose of them is to show us, to reveal to us who it is that Jesus is, what he has accomplished in the world, what he's about to accomplish in the world, and to show us through him what God is like. It's an abundance that we can't possibly have imagined ahead of time that God had planned for us. It's an abundance that even Jesus himself, when he arrived at the wedding, didn't know that he was going to reveal to everyone. And yet this is the moment when his disciples understand who he is and what he offers. Mary wanted a very ordinary kind of abundance. She had the guts to ask for it, and in that sweet motherly way to assume she was going to get it. But the abundance that Jesus created in the midst of that was so enormous that even he was surprised by it. And it wasn't something that Jesus did. I think that's clear that John wants us to understand that it wasn't a thing that Jesus did. It wasn't a magic act. It wasn't the miracle that did it. It was the very presence of Jesus that did it. He is the manifestation of the divine in the world. He is the Son of God. And when he comes into the midst of this crisis, into the midst of this need for abundance, both the ordinary and the spiritual and religious, his presence is what makes the difference. It's his presence in the lives of these people that makes this great wine appear. It is his presence in the midst of the world that makes the abundance of God available to us in ways that we could not possibly have imagined or anticipated or asked for. It's not a thing that Jesus did. It's a thing that Jesus is. He is the presence of God in our midst. As we enter into this new year of 2013, looking for the abundance, let's be like Mary and have the guts and the temerity to ask for the abundance we want. And then let's stick as close as possible to the presence of Jesus in our lives. Let's invite him into every aspect of our life, both religious and secular out in the world life, that we might experience blessings so amazing that we didn't either have the imagination or the guts to ask for it. Thanks be to God. Let us come before God and bring our lives and the fruits of our lives and offer them to God that they might be blessed to his service.